Hi, and welcome back to this third and final video focusing on the uses of the Olegtron 4060 Mark II. This particular video, the third one in the series of three, is focused on the sonic and other functional potentials of the 4060. And I say other because I think, as you'll see getting to know this instrument, you really can use it in ways beyond a pure sound generator. So this video today will focus on a variety of different approaches that you can take. And for those of you who enjoy more of the sonic side of these videos and less of the talking, I think you'll find a good deal of sonic focus and a little less focus on conversation, but there'll be a mixture of it. And as usual, you can fast forward as you like throughout these videos. So if you've noticed the space today, it's quite messy, and just yesterday I was working on some of the segments for this video, and I was using my soldering setup here to actually hold the electronic components, the capacitors, resistors, transistors, and so forth, such that I could get my macro lens in there. And indeed, in the first part of this video, I will take you through the different sounds that you could expect by simply using the various electronic components that come with the 4060. Now, I should say, encouragement, I think, is always out there to, say, dig through your garage and find new things that you can interface with the 4060. Not unlike the Coma Field Kit, which is just here to the left of the two 4060s that I have, I think there's opportunities to really experiment and do some things that are quite different. Again, these are so much different than, say, a workstation or a VST, where everything in a sense is pre-programmed for you. It sounds pristine, it sounds great, but I often feel there's not room for spontaneity and organic experimentation that I think really comes with these devices, the 4060s. So just yesterday, when I was shooting the video, I discovered I could take my speaker that actually came with the Coma Field Kit, and I could patch that in using some alligator clips, and you'll see that. I think one is still patched in here. And what's cool about the 4060 is because they use the breadboard cables, anything literally you find sitting around, whether it's some electronics component or not, through a combination of, say, some small alligator clips or alligator clip cables, could be used in combination with this device. It's pretty safe to do that. The speaker, for example, that has the inputs for the speaker, you can immediately patch that using some Arduino breadboard cables, the longer ones. The ones that come with the 4060 are these little mini ones. They're maybe, I don't know, 3-4 inches or something like that. These longer ones, if you have them sitting around because of your Arduino experiments or whatever, you could certainly take advantage of them. So the chaos on this desk, I think, really is almost like a visual metaphor of what these devices do. They can be very dirty, they can be disorganized, they could be prone to creating noise-based sources. I think that is really an indication of what you can begin to do with these particular devices. So in the video today, what I'll do is, first off, as I mentioned, focus on each of the components and what they sound like. Now keep in mind, I'm just going to run these to an in and out of the oscillator, the blue block on the 4060 here. And obviously, what's cool about this unit is you can start to use more of these components in combination with one another, and so that immediately changes everything up, sonically, rhythmically, whatever, harmonically. And that also can be altered by adjusting the two knobs, the current and the frequency. In the next part of the video, I will focus on the 4060 using some of the experiments I've done sonically, and I'll focus on it primarily as a sonic device. So what kind of sounds, what kind of drones, what kind of rhythmic sources can be created using the 4060s. You'll notice I'll use a few excerpts of longer videos, and as usual, if you want to see those, simply here on my YouTube channel, go to videos or go to my music playlist, and you'll find all of those, as well as all my videos on other devices like the Field Kit, the Soma devices, the Lyra 8, the pipe, and so forth. So you can go back through and find a lot of these videos. For this series, I'll focus in these three videos on the main features of the Olegtron 4060s, and some of those experiments I'll probably continue to do even after I'm finished with these three introductory videos. The next section of the video will focus on using the 4060 as an external sound processing device. Very generously, Olegtron provides us with these 4 input or outputs, and depending on how you patch it down here on this part of the block, it allows you to take sound in, it allows you to take sound out, and I think it could be very interesting for us to use these devices as external sound processors. It can really create some incredible glitchy sounds and maybe create something more in line with the Folk Tick here, if you know about their work, that sounds more experimental and more noise-based as opposed to pristine and nice sounding. And of course, pristine and nice are all very much right, like relative to your own taste as a performer, as a musician, as a sonic engineer, whatever. But in any case, I think real opportunities abound for us taking the 4060 and using it for some sort of external sound processing. So that'll be focused on in that section of the video. After that, I'll talk about the CV, the gate, the trigger potentials of the 4060. We can take any signal out from the device and use it with, say, a coma field kit. We could use it in combination with semi-modular synthesizers you might have, like the No Coast or the Capacitor audio phenol, provided in that case you could translate banana cable to 3.5 millimeter cables. We could, of course, also use it in combination in a variety of ways with our Eurorack gear, and indeed I'll show you some of those experiments. Possibilities include obviously going out of the device and coming into the device in terms of all those forms of modulation. We could use, of course, CV modulation in combination with audio experiments, whether audio processing of external sounds or combining, say, using the 4060 as a sequencer of sorts, taking its internal sounds out and combining those with Eurorack gear. And I think I'll show you one of those such experiments in that section of the video. Now, the next section of the video will focus on using the 4060 as an experimental device that allows you to use sensors in some curious ways. The other day I was in the garage and I found a potentiometer, which is really just a complex resistor if you think about it. And I started to experiment with this because I can just quickly take 2 or 3 breadboard cables, attach them to the potentiometer, run that in various ways, whatever I want to do in some of the blocks, in or out. I can then have a very experimental device that is even more experimental because I've added another form of feedback to that device, just using a very cheap potentiometer that I had sitting in the garage. Beyond that, in a more sophisticated level, I'll show you some of the, and unfortunately I don't want to knock anything over here, but I have a joystick sensor just hiding in here. I promise I will, as I potentially knock this off the stand, but this is a joystick sensor. And so it allows me to, in the past I've used these with my coma field kit, and I saw them in the garage sitting there, and I thought, why not try them with the 4060s? And the result has been, I think, pretty interesting initially, and I'll show you some of those experiments. Again, because I have breadboard outs from the sensor into the 4060, and I combine that maybe with the power block to power that sensor, I have an opportunity for taking something experimental, making it even more experimental. So for those of you using a 4060 potentially on stage in combination with sensors, perhaps light sensors, and there is, by the way, one component in here somewhere, which I can't find right now, but you'll see it, the LDR that basically allows you, on the demo video, I'll take my iPhone flashlight and shine that above that. You'll immediately hear an alteration, a change in the timbre, in the sound of the 4060 that's playing at the time. So using any number of these sensors, we've taken a device that's a really small footprint. If you're doing a stage setup that's incredibly small, this comes in very handy because it does so much in such a small space. And as I've said in other videos, in my unboxing video and my introduction video, such a cheap price for what you get in terms of the 4060. So using the sensors will focus on the experimentalism of this device, and that leads to the last section of the video, which talks about the possibility of using one of these in some very experimental senses, whether that's in terms of CV, whether that's in terms of audio, sound on the unit itself, audio processing, or some sort of combination with a lot of these different devices that you might have in your setup that gives us something new organic and experimental and hopefully personal to you as a performer, musician, sonic device creator, whatever it is that you happen to do. And as I've said in a lot of my videos, this is not a how-to. This is taking you through some of my uses of the 4060, some of the sounds I've created. What I love about YouTube is that you can get on and find new inspirations. And what I typically do is find one or two things. It could be a patch, it could be a use of sound, it could be a new instrument. And I try to see, can I incorporate that in my setup? And I really encourage you to do that, because I think it would be a disservice to Olegtron and these instruments to suggest that there's a right and a wrong way to use them. There really isn't. And I think we should be very much open to experimentation, organic and personal uses of devices like these as they allow us to grow as a performer, musician, recording engineer, and so forth. So let's enjoy this video, and as usual, if you have comments and feedback, please include them in the comments section here on YouTube. And thanks for listening and watching to my YouTube channel. Okay, as I get to this next part of the demo, I was actually doing a pretty cool experiment using a speaker. This is the speaker that comes with the Coma field kit. And I was basically running 2 channels using my breadboard cables of the oscillator through the speaker. So essentially using the speaker as another one of the electronic components like the ones that come with the 4060. And so I did that, and I also took then the actual speaker, the out that goes into the speaker through the cable, and I plugged that into the Coma field kit, and I tried a variety of different things using some different microphones, some different effects, using an LFO and so forth. And I'll show you the result of that in some of the demos. But essentially what I'm trying to do here is show you each of the components that come with the 4060, and I'll just simply make a connection here for the sake of simplicity. I'm using a alligator clip setup here, and what I'll do is I'll put each of these components here for you, and then you can hear the sound of it, and I think it gives you a sense of all the different components and what they sound like. And I'll also use or show you some additional things that don't come with the 4060. One of the cool things about it is you might just have some old switches or knobs, and with very simple cables, with Arduino breadboard cables, with the alligator clip cables, you can very quickly create even more variation sonically, whether you're running it through some other component like a speaker, or you're experimenting with switches, knobs, and other dials. In a later video, I'll show you a little bit with sensors and how sensors could also be used to affect the circuit here on the 4060. So what we'll do then is we'll just go through each of these, and you'll get a sense of how the components sound when they're patched in a very simple circuit here. I'm basically just taking 2 outs, or an out, and then it's going back into the oscillator, and then 1 out into the mixer here that you'll hear. Okay, so this particular patch that you're hearing, I used in a recent experimental video, so you can check that out. It's called Drone War Impression 1. And I'll be showing actually two patches from that video, and I was hoping to do this because one of the things that happens with the Olegtron, not unlike say a modular Eurorack setup, is that you often end up forgetting a patch or being unable to replicate it. Again, the Olegtron comes with patch sheets, but one opportunity I think is to take an image of this and hopefully you can replicate what you've created. So this one really just started by patching out from the oscillator to the output, and I wanted to have something rhythmic and something that had some subtle variation to it. This ended up being quite interesting, and when you hear it on the other video I've done, not on this one because I'm giving you the dry signal only, but when you hear it with some effects, it really does have a sense of almost sounding like a kick drum. And so it has that, I think, drum beat sound that somewhat surprised me because I thought most of these sounds from the Olegtron 4060 MK2 would be more like glitchy or that 8-bit sort of video game sound to it. So as you can see, there's 3 LED lights and they're all patched in to the oscillator. So you can certainly just patch something, any of your components in the blue oscillator block and get some very interesting sounds. And you could see then the 3 LEDs and then the other component there. And if we want, we can actually take this and adjust. You're actually seeing a little bit the oscilloscope there of the sound. So we can do the pitch. Not really audible, and then go back up. I was actually trying to find that original. See, this in a sense presents a problem. The fact that I didn't notate, I mean, I could look on my video and see where the frequency knob was originally, but if I want to replicate that sound and use it again, trying to find it. Can't quite do it. So that's one thing, obviously, in addition to notating what components you have and where, you might think about the placement of your 2 dials. We can adjust the current a little bit, see if we get any difference. And in that video, the drone war, what I did was, at one point in the video, I added more current. And it gave it an interesting character. It almost reminded me of a filter. It started to filter out think in the video maybe it was some of the highs, but the sound of the drum changed a little bit. It sort of mellowed out, and it allowed me to do something in terms of sonic variation with that patch. Again, you can see the wave coming out here on the screen. And sometimes just very subtle movements on your two dials will result in pretty dramatic differences in both the sonic character of what's coming out of the machine and also the sequence that might be playing. And so yeah, we could go on, but I think for me what's cool about the Olegtron, like a Eurorack setup in some ways, is that again, not only can you experiment with your components where you place them on the machine, but also you can do a lot which is very subtle changes in your two knobs, the current and then the frequency knob. So just some opportunities to remember that there are many ways to create sounds here with the 4060. Okay, so we're looking at another patch here, and this one I also used in the recent Drone War Impression 1 video that I posted. Again, I'm doing this because I'm trying to just archive essentially what I created here. So for this particular one, I just used a series of capacitors. I used 6 of them. And the Olegtron manual mentions the fact that you can experiment with different sized capacitors, and they talked about how these larger ones will have a bigger effect and can create some sweeping effects and so forth. So this particular one I actually patched in a few different spots. So I patched in the oscillator block. I also patched here in the frequency block, and then I have one coming out of the pulse block there. Sorry, the sawtooth block. And in this particular one, essentially all I wanted to do, I started with a blank slate, and that's what's kind of cool. You can start with your Olegtron and take all your components out and start from scratch. Again, you could start with just LEDs, you could do a mixture of things, you could read about electrical components, learn a little more about them, and then have the opportunity to maybe make some more deliberate choices. A lot of times, at least so far, I'm doing things almost randomly and organically to see how they evolve over time. And so in this case, I said I'm just going to put the capacitors in some different locations on the blocks, and I really wanted to create, for this particular piece I was doing, a drone. If you heard my last patch here, which really sounded like a drum track in some respects, it had a much more rhythmic thing going on using the LEDs and how they draw the current, created that effect. So in this case, I just wanted to use these capacitors, and we can take the frequency. You could see then on the oscilloscope what the sound is like. Okay, so it's just kind of, and again, as I've mentioned in the last one, you often get to a sweet spot here on both of your dials where the sound radically changes. Very subtle movement of the knob, and you can see exactly what happened. We can increase the current, and again, a quite dramatic effect right there. Again there. Some really nice harmonics you're hearing here, and I have to say I've been very impressed with some of those. And I think it's one thing I would say about the 4060. I'm just surprised at the versatility of the sounds. I really thought it was going to be much more limited than it is. And we can take the current all the way back down, just to give you an idea of what that's like. It's cool seeing the waveforms on the screen as we do this. And then no longer audible. Yeah, so in any case, another example of the patch here. In this case, the goal was to create a drone that could have applications in various electronic music tracks. Okay, so this particular patch, we're using diodes for the first time. If you read the Olegtron manual, the diode essentially allows the current to only flow in one direction. And they make reference to the fact that you can get quite a bit of variation if you tweak the current knob. And one of the things I thought that was interesting about this is if we look at the oscilloscope here, you might note with the divider, basically what's happening here is you're getting a variation of the oscillator based on the bass pitch, and you'll note that these are marked in such a way that you get increasing divisions as you move up. So I thought we could just patch this up, and you'll see that and hear that. I'll just continue to move towards the right. last one. Okay, so we can make some adjustments maybe to the frequency. And just look at the variation we're getting in our waveforms here. Again, I think you see how expressive this instrument can be, maybe surprising many of us. You can also adjust the current then. See some, you hear and see some variation there. You can see that when the current is lower, we're hearing kind of that chirpy harmonic in addition to the oscillator. And then when we increase the current, because of the effect on the diodes, it eventually goes away. Yeah, so again, in looking at this particular patch, I wanted to just basically take advantage of diodes and try them out to see what sort of sound I might get based on another level of experimentation here. Alright, so this is the first of a couple, I think, audio experiments I'll do using the 4060 as an external sonic processor. So again, in this video I've gone over a lot of the different sounds and functions, and to me this is one of the most exciting ones, particularly if you have a small stage setup that you're trying to utilize because you're low on space. If you watch a lot of the YouTube concerts that feature some sort of electronic music, someone like, say, Heinbach or someone like that, often they have a very small stage setup, and I think saving space could be inspiration or impetus to use one of these in your setups. So what I'm doing here is quite simple. You're hearing actually a drum beat. I'm just triggering Planck, which is a really great sound generator, and I'm using the Electro Kit, which is being triggered with this very simple pattern, and you're seeing that reflected on the screen as it's the same signal. So I'm just taking the output, which is this blue cable here, and I'm using my multiple only because I want to go two places. I want to take the sound in here and the sound into my ETC video synthesizer, just to give you a visualization of what we're hearing. But that's it. I'm taking the direct out. Again, you could take an MP3 player, you could take your looper, anything that you can plug in, which is anything really. I'm putting that in here, and using the simple patching of the 4060, that's going into my oscillator block here, and then I'm taking the out into this output here. This one is going directly into my mixer, and you're hearing that sound now. So at this point I have the unit turned off, and you're hearing just the dry signal coming out of the Planck. What I'll do next is turn on the 4060, and you'll see how dramatic the alteration in the sound is. And what I'll do is I'll turn the unit on, I'll tweak both of our tweakable knobs, and then I think we'll add some additional components to see what we can do using the 4060 as an external sound processor here with a very basic drum loop. So let's try some things out. Wow, I'm kind of amazed that this is actually the first time I've used this in this particular setup as an audio effects unit essentially. And if you've been listening to what I've been doing, I think the effect is fairly remarkable. So what's coming to mind as I was tweaking both of our knobs, again the current and the frequency knob, there were so many different sort of effects approaches that you could hear. One was an equalization of sorts, or perhaps low or high pass filters. As I was tweaking the knobs, you heard the different frequencies coming in and out. You also at times heard effects that sounded to me like a classic flanger, I believe, when I had the frequency a little higher. You also at points, as you tweak the knobs, hear bit crusher, decimator type sounds that you would traditionally hear with effects pedals, or of course with all the VST possibilities there as well. And then the other thing that was cool is when I adjusted the frequency knob at one point, you started, if you could see the synchronization, it's cool about the LEDs as you use them with the 4060, you can hear, not unlike with a trigger input that's flashing, say, in your Eurorack setup, you could hear what's happening and you can visually coordinate that right with exactly what's happening on the LED. But when that was happening, particularly as I had the frequency up here, you heard like other partials and harmonics being added to this sound. So to me, what would be really amazing, particularly if you used a lot of looping, like if you use Ableton, and I realize when you're triggering stems and working with Ableton, you can do this and probably more with Ableton. But again, there's something tactile and physical that I find useful with the 4060 in terms of being able to tweak knobs and patch things around a bit. And I think what could be cool is you could run your loops into one or two of these, and again, you can cross modulate between two of these and have some really crazy possibilities with essentially 8 in or outs on your two 4060s if you had two. But you could really do some remarkable sounds if you were doing like a DJ set or something like that. You could have your loops running in and you can make your alterations here. You could potentially do this with some circuits. And the other thing I thought of, I don't think I have one of my mini, oh I do. I haven't done this yet, but I was thinking with some mini breadboards or larger breadboards. And these mini ones, if you know, don't have the power inputs. And I haven't tried any of this yet, but I just have on order a larger breadboard. But one of the things I was thinking you could do is set up some patches essentially, right? Because it wouldn't be too hard to patch in some transistors, capacitors, whatever on your breadboards, and then you can have these essentially as patch blocks for your 4060s. And then all you would need, I believe, would be a couple of your breadboard cables, and you could patch in that way and potentially have, you know, pre-made presets ready to go. And that way, if you're doing a set or something, like I said, using this as an audio effects unit, you could pull these out and use them immediately. Now don't take my word for that, I haven't tried that yet, but it's something I want to try in the future, and probably I'll try it after this particular video is done. So again, if something is different with any of this stuff, or you have inspirations or ideas, please indicate those on the comments on YouTube. So let me just try one more thing. We'll continue with the same drum sound coming in, and let's alter up our components a little bit to see if we can further alter the sound. Okay, right now this is an additional application here using the pure sound from the 4060s. In this case I'm running two, and again I'm only using the two outputs from the 4060s as the main sound source. But what's interesting about this patch is that I'm essentially creating a feedback loop between the two 4060s. So just to explain this, this out and this out are both going to the mixer. Again, I'm using a splitter to give the signal to the ETC video synthesizer. The other ins and outs then are creating the feedback system here. It doesn't really matter how you patch this. What I'm simply doing is taking my oscillator block, going to the in or the out, again it really can be either, and creating an opportunity for this 4060 sound to go here and this 4060 sound to go here. What I'm doing on the mixer now is I just have this one playing, and I'll adjust this so you can hear that. Just adjusting the current and the pitch. But what I wanted to do is, let me shut this one off and listen to the difference in the sound. Turn it on. You hear that little... So that is the audio out from this 4060. And what's cool about that then is I can adjust the frequency here and create these interesting rhythmic opportunities. And like right now as I'm listening to it, I can't myself differentiate between which sounds are coming from here and which are coming from here. But that's kind of the cool thing about this, is in a sense you've turned two of these 460s into a mini modular system of interesting feedback, and you just hear the sounds and maybe you can appreciate what's happening. You hear that little squelch, that's this one playing into here. So that's pretty cool, just in terms of the feedback system created. Now let me bring the mixer down. I'll take the sound, this one out, and I'll bring this 4060 in, and we'll do the same thing. And I tried to create two radically different patches. This one's going into the reset block, so it's getting that kind of very, harsh on-off kind of effect. But let's do what we did with the other one. So let's turn this off. It's not as noticeable. Now that is pretty noticeable. Okay, so turn that off. And you hear kind of that phasing in and out. Okay, so you kind of get the idea. Again, we're just creating a feedback loop basically, and I thought next we would, looks like our ETC got looked up here a little bit. I don't know how that happened, but there we go. Must just be a setting. But let me go to my mixer and push up both faders. This time you'll hear both 4060s simultaneously. Again, our ear probably cannot differentiate which one is playing which part, which I think is kind of cool in terms of randomization and a new type of patch. And then I will adjust both of the units to see, again, the resulting sound in terms of this combination of two 4060s going into one another. So we'll turn up the faders. Okay, for this particular use of the 4060 as a CV generator, or I would almost say a CV mixer, I created a very simple patch here using two of the LED lights, and I simply took my breadboard cable from the oscillation block, and then this is triggering one of my modules, the Muskrat. And I also have the same signal triggering my ETC video synthesizer. What I thought though was, what if I also brought a signal in? So I just took an envelope, a CV signal from my envelope generator, and put that into this block here, or rather this input, and then took it from here and then put that into the oscillator block. And so what I'll do now is I'll change the envelope, and you'll just hear a variation in the sound. This is not super complicated what we're doing. So you could just see, based on how I'm altering the attack, the release and so forth on my envelope generator, I'm essentially using this as a CV mixer. Now, it may not necessarily be necessary, again, depending on your setup, to use it in this way, but it's one possibility. And then if I further alter the current and the frequency, you should hear an effect on our sound generator. So I think it's one way of introducing two things. One is randomization, and obviously using our different electrical components we can create new possibilities. And then the second thing it does, it allows me to have another device, external but connected to my Eurorec gear, that alters up the possibilities for my signal routing, my modulation, and so forth. And if I take out the CV in source, you could hear the difference in the sound here. So you see that was fairly dramatically affecting what we were doing. And so one thing I could do potentially is, if I had a complex sequence going, some rhythmic possibility, I could use this. I could dial it down all the way, the frequency, till I didn't hear my sound being triggered, and then I can just get it to the point where I want, and maybe depending on what I have patched, I could create some rhythmic complexity. You may already have modules in your Eurorec system that do something like this, various clock sources, dividers, whatever, but this is another possibility, I think, just to alter up what you're doing with some of your pre-existing modular or semi-modular gear. Alright, since you just heard that particular experiment, I thought we'd just begin with the building block of the first 4060. And I will be using two here, and again, I'm trying to suggest to you that two of these in tandem offer some, I think, powerful possibilities in terms of sonic, or in this case CV, experimentation. So we have the same setup as our last demo. This is simply a sequence which is triggering my Muffensif Muskrat. And I just have it, I don't have a camera up there, but it's going basically in the trigger input. Now I have an additional 4 inputs that I could use on the Muffensif that range from everything from the particular wavetable that's being selected to altering, distortion of the sound, the timbre, whatever. So I thought we'll try something different. So let's use our second 4060. Okay, so what I've done here is I'm taking just the one output here, and again, using that multiple, I'm basically taking 4 signals of this one 4060 and patching those into the 4 CV inputable, if that's a word, inputs that allow me to alter the sound. So right now we have the simplest possible patch, right? It's just an oscillator. And if we alter that, immediately you hear an effect. So in a sense, this is functioning almost like an LFO, right? Where it's allowing me to alter using the tuning and in this case the current, alter the 4 inputs on the Muskrat. And so it's an easy way, I think, just to use these devices, the 4060, as another opportunity to interface with your modular gear. And I think in particular, if you had a very small setup, a skiff case that just had a few modules, and of course even a small skiff case could hold quite a few if you had some 2HPs or some Erica or some smaller modules that are, essentially really space saving. But nonetheless, this all allows you to alter up your sound. But maybe this isn't interesting enough. So let's add some components to our circuit and see what happens to the sound. So just to reiterate, you're not hearing any external sound from either of the two 4060s. I'm using the first one to trigger my Muskrat module via CV. I'm using the second one also via CV with this particular circuit I have set up to trigger the 4 inputs that add sonic variation to the Muskrat module. Now, again, in your particular setup, you may already have devices or other units, modular or semi-modular, that accomplish this, but I think it's another interesting way to think about adding variety to some of your patches in terms of your Eurorack, your modular, or your semi-modular setup. So let's take a look at a series of additional CV experiments that I recorded a little bit a while ago. Okay, so I just came up with another use of the CV potential of the Olegtron 4060. And this one began, what I actually initially did was I routed each of the 4060s using an output as a CV sequencer essentially. And this is running into my Mofensief Muskrat. And then I took the audio outs and ran those as well. So I essentially had 4 channels of sound. I found it challenging to synchronize all of the 4 parts together to try to get these 2 rhythms to coincide, even if I had practically the same circuit. So I think that's one of the things that might be interesting to talk about on the comments page as you experiment with the 4060 is any aspect of trying to synchronize the 2 units. So what I came up with instead is actually kind of cool. So what I did was I took both of the outs just as CV and I ran it into my Pico Logic module. I don't have that up in the video, but basically I'm running one out, then the other out into the A and the B, and so those will be summed or subtracted in various ways, and then I'm taking the 4 outs that are all different from the logic, the Pico Logic, into the Mofensief. And let me just check this out. I've got, looks like the difference output is basically acting as the trigger into the Muskrat, and the 3 remaining outs, which include the sum, the maximum, and the minimum, are triggering the other parameters on the Mofensief. So what I like about this is just that it creates very interesting rhythmic textures, and what I'll do is adjust the 2 frequency knobs, and you get some interesting ratcheting effects, and you're seeing it visually as well on the screen here because it's synced to the ETC video synthesizer. But for me, it just creates a really interesting sound that maybe is a little bit different than if you were doing something with your Eurorack as a sequencer would come up with. And I've suggested this in the past, but I really think you could consider using the 4060 as a potential sequencer or a rhythmic source for your Eurorack or for your semi-modular setup. So let's just adjust the frequency of each and see what happens to the rhythms. Alright, so for this next section on the 4060, we'll look at using these devices as opportunities for experimental performance, and in particular using things like switches and sensors to take the performance, the sounds to another level. Now, you may already be familiar with using sensors. If you have one of the Coma field kits, one of the things that is quite innovative about it is that it has built-in blocks for sensors and switches. And we'll look at one of those in a second, because certainly one of the things you can do is use the signal out from the field kit and put that directly into one of your 4060s and then have that as a sensor input. What I want to suggest, though, is because of the format of sensors that allow for instantaneous or quick patching using breadboard cables into the unit itself, you really can completely bypass the Coma. Of course, in some sort of setup you might have for performance, which I think is where sensors and switches come in handy, you could certainly use a combination of devices. I've suggested in a lot of these videos that the 4060s pair well with all sorts of other devices, including, I would say, the Coma field kit, some of the Soma gear to add some drone components and so forth. So I thought first we would look at something I guess you could say is not really a sensor per se, and this is one of the advantages of using the 4060s. Because of the patching opportunities, you could literally go and find switches that you have. Could be something like this. You could take a simple push button switch, and because everything allows you to connect a breadboard cable, in some cases you could thread it right like that, or better yet, I like to use these alligator clips, and what I often do is I will plug in a breadboard cable, and then because these make such a nice contact with the metal, plug this in and plug it on the other end of whatever it is I'm trying to control or utilize. In this case, it's a simple potentiometer, and one of the things I recommend is when you're getting into something that has more than one point to be patched, you sometimes have to experiment, plug things in different places to see what will work, and we'll do that in this case here. So I might begin with just patching in, let's say, 2 points. And what I've done, I have to review myself, I've plugged these both into the blue oscillator block. And then what I can do in this case is, since it's a potentiometer, and sometimes my contacts are out there, I will just turn the dial and listen to the effect. And so it sounds like what it's doing is maybe bringing in another one of these oscillator points in terms of the dividers. So it doesn't have a dramatic effect. Just trial and error for a lot of this. So if I patch it to this point, I hear nothing happening. So it's not scientific, it's not what an electrical engineer would do, but if you want just an easy, quick approach that's certainly safe for your equipment, this is one way of approaching things. So I've determined that this has an effect when I turn it. I can add the third point. And in this case, let's put the third point actually in the red power block. I'm thinking maybe that'll have a choke effect or something like that. And again, these are not super easy here. They're just getting a little tight in the space. Let's add this and see what it sounds like. You can see it's changed the oscillator sound. So I'm assuming we're hearing it all the way in the I guess it'd be the counterclockwise direction. It sounds like then it's triggering this, right? Which is maybe choking some of the current to the circuit. And then I turn it, and we hear that similar sound in the beginning. So it seems like we have 3 points there, which would make sense, which with the 3 points on the potentiometer. What I could do is continue to experiment, and again, using colored cables, it makes it easy. These would probably match, but I know my brown cable goes with my yellow one, so I could put it in the saw block there. Has a different sound to it. And I could continue to repeat. I could put it in the reset block as well. But I was going to say, with something like this, we could fine-tune it and maybe get to a sweet spot. where we get some interesting harmonics going or something like that. I guess I would say that's a first example of doing something. I know that's not a sensor, but it's an example of a switch you might just have lying around in your garage, and as a result of it, you can very easily patch it and use it as part of your performance setup. Again, I think this is all individualistic in terms of how you might use the various devices here, but it's one opportunity maybe to try something different and a little more experimental. Okay, next let's take one of our sensors. Actually, some time ago, related to the Coma Field Kit, I did a pretty lengthy overview of using sensors with the Field Kit. And I actually picked up this particular sensor kit on Amazon. I want to say it was like, between 15 and 20 bucks. Not very expensive. And you'll notice with sensors, you can have between 3 and I think the ones I have are 5 prongs. And in most cases, these are labeled. This is a simple on-off switch. And typically, you'll see a data prong, a 5 volt, and a ground. And I'll talk about the 5 volt. It seems like in a lot of cases, your sensor might need power, and so you could use the power block on the 4060. But as in a lot of cases, you could simply experiment, right? You could plug these in and using your breadboard cables and see what happens. So, but sensors are so cheap to purchase, and they're so varied, ranging from simple on-off switches to these water or moisture humidity switches, which are kind of cool. You can use a dropper, put water in here, and have some really dramatic effects on your sound and your CV modulation and so forth. Keep in mind for this demo on the sensors right now, I'm using the sound, the output, direct out from the 4060. I could be sending that same signal into some of my CV gear and create an interesting effect. I could do it simultaneously, whatever. And that's what's really cool about using these units, is you can mix and match in and out using the sensors in a lot of different ways. But let's begin before we go internally with our sensors. And this particular switch will detect the movement and create an alteration, in this case of the sound. So we're going to take the signal output right into the 4060. Okay, so in this case, I just repatched this. I lost my sound for some reason. I don't know what happened. But I'm just taking the straight oscillator out, and then, as I said, I have my new patch point, which is the signal out from the field kit, into this in, and then I patch that from the in-out block into the oscillator block. And so as I move this, you'll hear the change in the sound. And I can also patch it into the power block for a different sound. So you can see it's pretty subtle, that particular sound. Okay, so again, we don't have to use the field kit. We can use everything internal to the 4060. So let's try that right now. So I will say, using sensors, in some cases I was thinking that the power block would have to actually power the sensor input, the 5 volt input on the sensor. I'm discovering though that's not always the case. So we can check out this sensor here. You can see what happens when I tilt it. So I just patched the 3 points into the oscillator block. And I guess I would say with any of these sensors, like your patch points and your electrical components, to simply experiment. It doesn't hurt anything to plug one of your cables into the reset block. If that doesn't do anything, try another patch point. And it's really part of the discovery aspect, I would say, of the 4060s, the fact that you can keep patching and trying new things and seeing if it works, and if it doesn't work, continue to patch away. And I think what I would suggest is a combination of sensors. I know when the field kit came out, they suggested one use there was for art installations. I can certainly see the 4060s being used in such a sense, right, where you could use different sensors, could be proximity sensors, could be light sensors, in an art installation of some sort, and these could be your sound generators, and as the individual interacted in that space, you know, the sound would change, or a control voltage out would go to, say, doesn't have to be the ETC video synthesizer, but I'm thinking more of a Eurorack video synthesizer that could project an image or alter an image or alter the color of it or something like that, such that you have an interactive space. Sensors are pretty incredible in that sense, in that you could really create an immersive space that would allow for some fascinating explorations with visitors to an art space. And it would take so very little, really, for just over $100 and another $20 or something for some sensors, you could do something quite sophisticated in terms of creating something that is interactive. So that's, I think, a real possibility to think about as a possible use of the 4060s. And the other thing I would say is if you're doing a small performance setup that maybe involves some Korg Volcas, some 4060s, a field kit, an OPZ or something like this, maybe a small skiff Eurorack case, you could really use these sensors to generate some complex patches, to change some things visually if you're using a video synthesizer, to do some things in an interesting sense, perhaps using solenoids if I want to take advantage of some of the electroacoustic possibilities here, or you can't see them, some of my other modules, my Bastel modules that have more sophisticated opportunities for DC motors and solenoids, then these would come in very, very handy. And the other thing is, by patching these in here, the simplicity of doing that, because everything is based on a breadboard connection, in a sense, this becomes a mixer for sensors, right? You could really use it, generate a signal at this end, and then that signal goes out, whether it's audio or control voltage, affects other things in your environment. And that's why I like these devices. I think they really encourage you to use them as a standalone device for sound, for CV, or to affect other gear out there, other events, depending on what you're doing. Again, it's very hard to say what this might be. Let's take a look at a second sensor now. Okay, and I'm just bringing up the volume here on the second 4060. And this is a joystick sensor. This also came with my collection that I purchased on Amazon for well under $20. In this case, we have 5 patch points. Again, those of you sophisticated with electronics will know what each of these is. But you know, for my system, it's very easy just to experiment and to try some things out. So again, I'm plugging, let's see, 1 into the saw block, the other 3 into the main oscillator, and then another one into the reset, and then 1 into the power block. And what I'll do is I'll turn this joystick and you'll hear some effects. At some point in turning this, you might notice the sound completely cuts off. Again, that leaves you room for more experimentation to go back over your patch and to see if you can repatch in such a way where maybe a particular movement of the joystick has, and you're hearing it there and you see it on the screen, has a different effect that is maybe other than just killing the sound. Now this could also be useful, right? I could be in a performance and immediately be able to kill the sound. A push button switch sensor, which I was showing you earlier, would also accomplish that. But it really is based on your needs as a performer, what you want to accomplish using the sensor. But let's try this out a little bit to see some of the possibilities of the sound that it can generate. Yeah, so that's actually pretty cool. I don't know if you could tell what was happening there. You could see on the screen kind of visually what was happening in terms of the audio, but um, it's quite sensitive actually, so I'm trying to very slowly turn it clockwise. You're seeing the sound change on the screen. It's very hard to do this. And you hear different harmonics at different points. And then again, when I press the joystick left and up, essentially I'm not, the sound is killed. So what I could do is I could continue the patch, and this would be an opportunity really for thinking about experimental feedback systems as a performer. And you could even do some of this. So Vlad Kramer from Soma does like body synthesizers where he puts sensors and devices on his body, and he creates sound that way. So you could create something based on your application, create your patch points as far as the sound, what do you want it to sound like, and then if you come up with any spots with the sensor, depending on what the sensor is, in this case a joystick, that are not desirable and that you want a different sound, continue to experiment with your patch points and see if you can accomplish something different. Now, I really won't go over the rest of these sensors today because I think you can go online and check out all the sensors out there. I will just say that there are so many opportunities to use sensors in a performance setting that it really does show you how far electronics have come, particularly with a lot of these boutique companies like Olegtron. Again, in such a small space for a relatively very low price, you can do a variety of things with this particular box. It incorporates so well with so many aspects, I think, of electronic music, and in this case, I think it emphasizes the possibility of doing something more experimental in terms of control systems, in terms of using these devices as hubs for sensors, not unlike the Coma field kit. So next we'll go into experimental sound design and the use of the 4060s. Alright, so we will focus on this last section on using the 4060s in experimental senses. And before I start that, I wanted to mention something that I addressed earlier in the video and I had a chance to try. And my idea here was to take a breadboard like this and to basically turn it into a patch. And so the concept here might be if you're playing live or if you need to recall what essentially could be presets quickly, you may not have time to patch things in. One issue, of course, is, I've mentioned this in, I think, video 1 on this series, that if you want to indicate a patch point, obviously you can take a picture of that. You can also use the provided sheets. You can come up with your own grid to indicate the patch points. It's not always the easiest thing to do just because of the nature of patching a device that has so many potential in and out points. So one concept is to take a breadboard like this, and there are larger ones as well. This is a mini one, which could be good in terms of the size factor. Patch in your components, your capacitors, resistors, transistors, whatever you have. And I advise you go online and look at the how-to guides on breadboards because there is a little bit of getting to know how they work. But once you figure that out, essentially you could have your patch here, and you would simply need some breadboard cables, and you could plug these in, or this in, and you'll hear the effect of the sound. So in any case, using this as an example, I think just looking at it and the concept of this as a sort of patch for the 4060 that you could use in some interesting sonic senses reminds us of how experimental these devices are. And so in this last section of this third overview video of the 4060, I want to then get into the value of these instruments as experimental devices. Okay, so in this last section on the 4060 as an experimental toolkit, I wanted to focus on the idea that these devices, I think, can take you out of your comfort zones sonically, so they produce certainly, even at the raw level, some sounds that are unlike, I think, any others out there. And also, I think just the approach to patching that I've demonstrated in some of this video also really suggests it's something that is really different than some of your other devices. And I think with new companies coming out there, more boutique companies like Coma, Soma, and other ones, Olegtron, perhaps a smaller company, they really have rethought the way that we interface with our electronic instruments. And I should say, in creating some of these experiments, oftentimes they don't work out. And in fact, I'll show you a video right now. I was working on something recently utilizing one of my Bastel modules, and I love the modules that they create. Specifically, I was using the, I think it was the servo motor or the DC motor. They're very similar. And I created a contraption using some RC Hobby propeller blades, and I put some guitar strings on there, and anyway, I'll show you the video here. And the funny thing that happened at the end of the video, the one of the strings got wrapped onto another one of my instruments. And so sometimes, you know, you have failures in your process of trying to experiment with new approaches to sound or interfacing or CV control or whatever it is that you're doing. So certainly this experiment today will be no different in terms of that sense of trying to do something, and we'll see how it works. And of course, there's always the ability to do it a second time or to do some editing and so forth, but hopefully this will come off as organically as possible in terms of what I have envisioned. I did want to mention one other thing in terms of experimentalism. I didn't get a chance in these 3 videos on the 4060 to try any of the breadboard interfacing with, say, other instruments or modules out there that would maybe be appropriate. So, for example, my Folk Tech here, the conduit and resist, if you watch one of my other videos, I created this patch board that allows me to do some patching in a bigger format. And I haven't yet tried to interface the two. One of the things they've mentioned is to be sure that the instruments on the other end can handle what you're pumping into them. I did read that if you were to blow the chip here, and I think there's a protection for that, you could replace it relatively easily. I saw that on the Olegtron forum, which right now I notice doesn't have a lot of people participating, but maybe that will increase as more word gets out about these unique instruments. So I haven't tried that yet, but in this particular experiment today, I will use breadboard cables to take 2 speakers and incorporate those as part of the circuit here, and also I will mic those 2 speakers to create, I think, an interesting effect in terms of some of the sonic things that will be happening here. So I'll close on this experiment, and I actually did create a flowchart. I'll put it up on the screen, and I typically will share the PDF of this with you on my academia.edu page if you're so inclined to look at it. By the way, in the future, I'll be doing a series on going modular. It's not really a series about learning how to do modular. It's more of a conceptual series about some issues and ideas that you might think about in terms of making a move to the Eurorack modular world, which I did over the last year or so, selling a bunch of my gear, including my semi-modular gear, and moving into new sonic and CV control terrains. So this particular experiment, looking off my cheat sheet here, and I set this up today because I really wanted to think about it conceptually. And so I designed 3, these are kind of obvious, but 3 signal pathways. Of course, audio, CV, and then the third is a physical effect. And by physical effect, I'm really getting into what's happening with these 2 speakers, particularly in terms of the using of a solenoid that will be banging very near one of the speakers. So this began with the idea, could I take one speaker and run it as part of the circuit here? So as I've talked about in some previous experiments, I took 2 breadboard cables and then attached those to the alligator clip cables and then attached those to the speaker. I also, in previous experiments, have taken a sound out into the speaker. I won't be doing that today. So I'm essentially creating a circuit here, so that affects what's coming out of the 4060, both in terms of the audio and the CB. And I really like the fact that you can use this in very versatile ways with the 4 ins or 4 outs as you choose to use them. And so this becomes part of the circuit, but then it also becomes an additional audio output that is different. It won't have the same rhythmic or timbral, certainly rhythmic quality, because it's patched in such a way that it will not have the same rhythm being played as what's coming out of the main out. And then of course in terms of the sound quality itself, it's coming out of the speaker. And if you remember, I remember back in high school playing with experiments of these little speakers, and they sounded very tinny and very trebly, but there was something unique about their sound. And in doing some experiments with those in the past, I've always found them to be very interesting in terms of just the sonic quality. So I have a piezo mic here. And again, this all started with this idea of this drone. The piezo mic is running up into ears. And I just found with this particular approach, how loud it was coming out of the speaker, the amplitude, whatever, I had to run it first into ears, and that has a really high gain setting, so I can really crank that. And then I just took the simple out into the coma, and I further cranked that a bit, and then I'm taking the main out there. So essentially I have an amplified speaker that has a particular sound like a drone, a rhythmic drone, coming out of the first 4060. Now, totally by accident today, I was working with one of my homemade solenoids. This is one I picked up just cheap on Amazon and made the cable for. And I have these I started using these because they came with my Bastel modules, and I just think they're the best and easiest to use because you can take a raw cable and pop it right in there, screw this down, and then it has your typical this in this case, this is just your jack that's going to go in for your signal, and that's very easy to use. But here's what happened in terms of creativity. I was looking, thinking I was going to use this on my tone drum, which I enjoy quite a bit. It has some interesting sonic qualities to it. My plan was to have the solenoid hit the tone drum, and I simply set this down here, and I turned on the Olegtron, and it was banging up against the speaker, and I had the mixer channel for that particular sound up, and I thought, oh, that's actually kind of interesting. So it will take the drone I have going here and alter it a bit, and the unpredictability of where the solenoid will hit, whether it hits the speaker, whether it hits the contact mic a little bit, I think will add to that sense of something organic in terms of the sound. And I probably will do some post-production on this particular drone. I typically do that dumping everything into Logic off my Allen Heath mixer. In this case I have 7 channels going in, and when I do these experiments I like to do each channel separately for obvious reasons, so I could create some sense of stereo spread in the mix. I can alter things if one of the, if I do everything as a left and right out of the mixer, I have to get it right on the first take. So in this case, I do each channel separately. So in any case, this became the first part of that drone. I then added a second one here, and this is a different type of, I got these online for, I'm not sure the application of these, it's a Daytona Audio, a different type of speaker. And I have another contact mic there, and that one's going directly into ears and out into the mixer. And so that one I think could be interesting as well. And I should say, in addition to that, before it goes to the mixer, it actually goes to my, I'm not sure if it's on camera now, my Soma pipe, the Orpheus patch, because that has a really interesting effect sound that I don't get in any of the other my effects pedals or in Logic's interesting array of effects. And I should say, I'm forgetting stuff as I go along, which shows you why I had a patch sheet. With the first speaker, the drone out, I have it going into these 2 cheap Donner pedals, and if you know these, you can get them new for a little over 20 bucks a piece. And I just took a shot actually to use these. I wanted to use them on a recorder, on a wind instrument, and I ended up using it for this patch. So this is a harmonizer, and I might adjust it from the 7th to the 5th to the 2 octave below. And this is a mod pedal, and in particular I'm using the tremolo, and what I'm trying to do is take the tremolo rate And as something rhythmic is going on in one of the 4060s, and again, these are my two main clock sources and audio sources, then I'll try to maybe match that tempo. We'll see how it goes in terms of the mix. So that will have some effects. So both drones have hopefully enough effects pre that in post-production I don't have to spend a lot of time adding, say, reverbs from Logic. And I do enjoy a lot of those Logic reverbs, the Space Designer ones that add, they're all found if you go into Logic, they're all in the warped settings, which I think are pretty fascinating how those sound. And I should say in terms of the second speaker, I do have it set up, it actually is patched up. I take back what I said earlier. I mean, I have this one patched up to the board here, which is my patch board. So I actually have coming out of, I think, the Vactrol and the oscillator blocks. The conduit is a really complex Eurorack module that I don't fully claim to understand, and if you go online you can't necessarily find a full module. It's a very, I think, mysterious module. So I've patched it in using alligator cables right off my patch board, which has the stainless steel screws, and then that's giving the sound into that particular speaker, and then I've contact mic'd that up, and then that is going through the Soma pipe. So it has kind of like, I think you'll see a lot of different sonic character with these two drones. So these will form the basis of the bed of the music. The two additional audio outs are coming out of the two 4060s, and those I probably will have to do something in post, because a lot of the sound that comes out of the 4060s, it's very raw, it's very video gamey, it's very glitchy and blippy, and I think it needs some post-production, and we'll see how that goes. Again, because I record these as two separate channels, I can choose how much of that I want to come out in the mix, and I can do fades and bring the different tracks in from time to time. I also will likely use the joystick sensor that's directly plugged into the second 4060 to give you some different sonic things happening. I have two multiples coming out of each of the 4060s, and partially for the first one I'm shooting some audio signal into the ETC video synthesizer, and then each of those will have the audio out into the mixer, and then what I'm doing is using that simultaneously then as a control voltage signal. So for example, with the Bastel solenoid module, I simply have it coming out of this 4060 going into there, triggering that, and then I can use that as part of my physical component that's happening with that first speaker there. So the idea behind this was that somehow all these pieces would organically connect to one another, and as I was looking at my patch sheet, I realized that the conduit was sitting out there by itself. It didn't have, it had connection to the speaker, but I thought it's not really connected to the main 4060s either at an audio or a control level, and so I said I'll just take the splitter out of the second 4060, and that's going into the time CV input on the Folktech. And the Folktech, I think in this usage you'll see, has some really interesting sound to it. I'll probably adjust the oscillator mix on the resist module as well. So the other thing that's happening then is I have 3 channels of sound that are being triggered at different levels, and as you know, in any modular setup, sometimes you take the pure signal from something, other times you modify it. So I think I have 2 modifications going on. One is going into my divider module, and that is giving me an ability. What I love about divider module is I can tweak the amount based on the tempo, based on the rhythm, and you can create some interesting subdivisions of the beat. You can do a lot of interesting things rhythmically that I think allow you to do some fine tuning while you're performing it live. And then I have another clock signal going into the qubit chance, which is a really neat module that has so many clock outputs, and I'm using that to basically trigger a couple of the muskrats, 2 of those going, and then the carp. And I'm trying to do different sonic things with the carp versus actually all 3, the carp and the 2 muskrats, just to not let those sort of intrude on one another in the mix. And I also, I think, have an envelope going affecting at least one of the set of parameters on one of the muskrats, and that envelope is probably just going to be fixed on my radar. module. So I think that's the entirety of it. Again, we'll see how this goes in terms of the actual mix and what it sounds like, but what I wanted to do to end this third and final video on the 4060 is to suggest something about the value of these two instruments as experimental devices. I mentioned to someone on YouTube recently that these really do feel like a combination of sonic devices that I think are inherently avant-garde in nature and electronic toolkits. The fact that you're plugging things in and putting in transistors and different resistors and so forth really does suggest to you something much different at the most basic physical tactile level, and I think that translates also just to how you conceive of, say, patches and sound design and so forth. And the other thing I wanted to do with this was to say, can I get back to some of that world of acoustic, electric, physical sound that happened for me first when I got my Coma, which was one of my first introductions into this world of electroacoustic, and I eventually got down the road and got a couple ear modules and also 3 of the Bastel modules. And so it reminded me of the opportunity to go backwards in time a little bit and to really focus on possibilities of using all this gear in tandem with one another. So I hope you had an opportunity to learn something and to appreciate a few things about the 4060s. As usual, in the video comments on YouTube here, give me some feedback, talk about some of your experiments, share some of your videos. Again, I'm doing this all on a volunteer basis, and I'm not sponsored, I don't make any money off this, so it's a pure form of pleasure for me and opportunity to develop some community in terms of YouTube and some of the interesting musical things that are going on with electronics, modular, semi-modular, whatever. So thanks for listening, and I will now then share with you as a close to this long video, I realize it's long, this experiment today here, working on 2 4060s, using them as a basis, a foundation for a number of things happening with my modular, my Coma, and also some of these physical things with these speakers that become part of the circuit.